if you talk to people who think that what I did is the right thing, then they say, oh, that's a courageous woman. If you talk to people who think what I did was the wrong thing, they say she's a liar, she's an infidel, she's a heretic, she should be killed, imprisoned, banished, cancelled. So you take your pick.
Christopher Hitchens said that Ayaan Hirsi Ali is perhaps the most important public intellectual to come out of Africa. She has written best-selling memoirs such as Infidel and Nomad, and she's one of the most important voices on the public stage today, especially as the West is roiled by multiple simultaneous crises. Let me give you a bit of a taste of how illustrious and storied her career has been by reading from her bio here. She is a researcher at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and the founder of the AHA Foundation. She was a fellow at the Belfer's Center of Future Diplomacy Project at Harvard University and a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ayaan's journey began in Somalia in 1969, where as a young girl, she was subjected to female genital mutilation. From very early on, she questioned the subjugation of women she saw all around her. While listening to a sermon on the many ways women should be obedient to her husbands, she couldn't resist responding. Ayaan's path led her to many places, but upon being forced by her father to marry a distant cousin, she fled to Holland and claimed political asylum. Once there, she worked her way up from being a janitor to serving as an elected member of Dutch Parliament. As a member of Parliament, she campaigned to raise awareness of violence against women. In 2004, and I remember this very vividly, she gained international attention following the murder of Theo Van Gogh. Van Gogh had directed her short film Submission, a film about the oppression of women under Islam. The assassin left a death threat for her pinned to Van Gogh's chest. This tragic event and Ayaan's life leading up to it are chronicled in Infidel. Since then, she has moved to the United States. She married the internationally renowned historian Neil Ferguson and had several children. She also recently converted to Christianity and launched a new media outlet called Courage Media, and she joins us to discuss that new venture and her life now. So before we get into your new media venture, just to give some of our listeners a sense of your story, which is one of the things that makes this new media platform so compelling, because I think it informs both your operation and a lot of the interest in it. You've written 2 memoirs, both Infidel and Nomad. I read them years ago when they came out. Maybe give us some background to kind of let people know why you started this up.
So in terms of my background, I came to the West in 1992, in the summer of 1992, and I was running away from a forced marriage. I had no choice in the matter. And before I came, I lived in Nairobi, Kenya for 10 years. And then prior to that, my family, we fled. We were in Ethiopia for a year and a half, and then we were in Saudi Arabia for a year. And before that, we were in Somalia. That's where I was born in 1969. My father was in politics. He was put in prison. There was a socialist takeover, a Marxist takeover, with the help of the Soviet Union, of the government that he was serving, actually trying to organize and build. And so I have that political background, which is not really mine. It's my father's, but we grew up in, I'd say, to call it political turmoil is an understatement. And then I think the important part of my childhood was growing up in Kenya. We went there in 1980. We lived there I was there for 10 years. That's where I learned to speak English and where I went to secondary school. What's significant about that period in my life was I was a teenager when the Muslim Brotherhood came into our school and into our neighborhoods, and I sort of transformed from being just an ordinary Muslim. Maybe I always say my Islam, the source of my Islam was my grandmother and my mother, and it was harsh, it was tribal, and it wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't political. And the Muslim Brotherhood, they introduced something that's intellectually interesting, religion as a purpose. We were taught to not just become aware of our faith ourselves and practice it, but to then command right and forbid wrong. In other words, go to the family members and friends and neighbors and tell them, hey, you guys, the way you practice Islam is wrong. This is how to do it. And then once you've achieved that, then to go to the non-Muslims who were living in Kenya, which was technically a Christian country, and we would go around trying to persuade the Kenyans to come to Islam, which was very annoying, I have to tell you. I mean, we were annoying. We were a pest. Another moment is 1989 when Salman Rushdie got the fatwa from Ayatollah Khomeini. I had been brainwashed enough to agree with that fatwa and to actually go and protest along with people who were causing problems and were really dumb enough to buy the book and burn it. And then my father came. My father had left us in Kenya. He left us in 1981. He came back in 1991. And then by that time, I was a grown woman. I was 21, 22 years old, and he decided he was going to marry me off. And that's how I found my way to the West. I asked for asylum in the Netherlands. I lived there for 10 years, and then 9/11 happened. And that really was another moment in my life that I'd say was, I don't know what to call it. It was, again, transformative and totally unplanned, because all I did was really take a position in a conversation that was about what just happened on 9/11/2001. And the position I took was those men who hit the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and were on their way to the White House, they were not motivated by all of these other reasons that you guys are giving. They were motivated primarily by their faith. And I started describing what that faith meant and my time in the Brotherhood, with the Brotherhood and all that. So that's really, in a nutshell, my background. And people use the term, it depends. If you talk to people who think that what I did is the right thing, then they say, oh, that's a courageous woman. If you talk to people who think what I did was the wrong thing, they say she's a liar, she's an infidel, she's a heretic, she should be killed, imprisoned, banished, cancelled. So you take your pick.
Well, they've said that quite explicitly, and you mentioned Salman Rushdie, the fatwa against him in 1989, and I wanted to ask you about that because I had almost forgotten about the fatwa against Salman Rushdie until somebody with a knife came for him in 2022 in New York City, and he's already written a memoir about this, and he says when the guy comes at him with the knife, he had this thought, oh, it's you. Like you're the one who's finally going to carry out this fatwa that's actually been hanging over my head for so long that most people have forgotten about it. But of course, you had something similar hanging over your head when your friend Theo Van Gogh was stabbed to death in the Netherlands after you worked on a short film with him exposing the abuse of women under Islam. And as part of the note stabbed into his chest, it was a death threat against you. How does that ongoing reality affect your life? You were one of the first people I thought of when I read the news of what happened to Salman Rushdie, because these things, those of us who read these things and we follow these things, you kind of forget about it once it's enough years in the past. You're like, this probably isn't a big deal anymore. But what is that like, the day-to-day reality for you still, having this hanging over your head?
So I think the forgetting about it, that is sort of a natural process. I don't know how old you are, but maybe you lived through some of the spectacular terrorist attacks that occurred in Europe. Mm-hmm. So at first, as you know, it's shocking, it's compelling, it's all that you can think about, and it's frightening. And I have to admit that I was and still am very frightened. But then as time goes by, you learn to live with it, and you learn to protect yourself, and you learn to survive. And it's not just the toll that it takes on, in my case, my freedom of movement is highly constrained. But it is the toll that it also takes on you mentally. This constant fear that's hanging over your head. And not just that, I also had the feelings of just awful guilt towards Theo. This constant replay in my head of what if things had gone differently? What if we didn't make the film? What if he had, just taken that different route to work? What if he didn't have his address in the telephone book? What if the mayor of Amsterdam had protected him? By the time when Theo Van Gogh was killed, I lived in the Netherlands and was surrounded by armed men protecting me, moving me from address to address. So you just get into this what if. And so it's mentally and it's physically and it's spiritually daunting. But the question remains for all of us, those of us who are individually threatened and those of us who are collectively threatened, like you are collectively threatened simply for not being a Muslim. I'm individually threatened because I left the faith and then I said things that weren't appealing about Islam. Regardless, what do you do about this threat? What name do you give it? How big is it? Should we carry on talking about it? And that is 20 years ago when I first joined this conversation. And it was in that period around 9/11. It was really right after 9/11. The general attitude was, this is a threat against America because of American foreign policy. And then when I started to get the threats and it settled in the Netherlands among the commentariat, it was seen as a threat specifically against me or against Theo Van Gogh because as individuals, we provoked them. Mm-hmm. But now as time goes by and you have these random terrorist attacks and random people are hit and killed and maimed, it's now settling in many, I would say, intellectual quarters. This isn't just a threat against one individual who provokes them or America or Israel or some other country that has policies they don't like. This is against all of us. And especially in Europe, where through immigration and through the permissive, in my view, yes, permissive environment where they can preach this hatred, we now have hundreds of thousands of people who think that people who don't believe in exactly the same way that they believe in their God ought to be killed. That's now a problem that we just have to figure out how to get ourselves out of this conundrum.
And I wanted to hone in on that because there's two kinds of stories that have been covered a lot at Courage Media, and it covers sort of the Pincer threat facing the Western civilization. You have on one side this massive influx over the past decades of Islamist immigrants, and on the other hand, you have sort of woke cultural Marxists. The phrase is a moving target, but you know which people that I'm talking about. They're the people that won Donald Trump the election. And what I find sort of interesting is that right after 9/11 and the decade after 9/11, there was a huge surge of interest in this idea of mass immigration and the sorts of people who were coming in and specifically the worldviews that they held. Like what kind of beliefs do they bring with them to the West? And there was your book, Infidel. There was Mark Stein's book, America Alone. There was a bunch of different books at the time. I had at least one whole shelf of them, of just books on that subject. And then about 5 to 10 years later, people started to move on to the woke threat. And it seemed like for about 5 years, people had really forgotten about this other threat and that the Islamist protests in response to the October 7 attacks reminded us, oh, by the way, everything Mark Stein said, everything you said at the time, everything Douglas Murray said in The Strange Death of the West, this is still ongoing. Like we've been focused on this new thing for a while, but this is still going on at the same time, simultaneously. Especially when you saw, like in Canada, for example, you had celebratory riots breaking out just after October 7. All of this stuff happening long before the Israeli response, right. Because people could justify it. No, we're protesting the Israeli response. The support and the celebration all happened before that. And so do you think we've seen sort of people waking back up to the fact that we haven't moved on from the Islamist threat to the woke threat, but we are now facing this sort of Pincer threat, and both of these things need to be addressed?
So Courage.media, which is the platform I started, is basically to say we're not going to accept self-censorship. If you have something to say and it's true, here's a place where you will not be cancelled. You can put your ideas forth. And I was cancelled on so many different levels. And so it is, here's what I think, and it is an invitation for people to come and discuss, and know that they have a place where they can, they can express their ideas and their theories without being called far right, racist, without being vilified, without being cancelled. You laid out now three things that are interrelated, and all of them have something to do with either censorship or self-censorship. So first, it was this threat that we were talking about, which was radical Islam that threatens to take your life if you disagree with them, or threatens terrorist attacks unless you submit to whatever it is that they're demanding. So that's one threat. And the way we responded to it in the West was to try very hard to say this has nothing to do with Islam. And I think that came from a good place. It was to make Muslims who are not interested in terrorism and who are good law-abiding people to say, we don't want to exclude you, and we don't want to offend you by saying bad things about your religion. We can make a distinction between you, the good guys, and these bad guys who are using your religion or abusing your religion to do bad things. So that's one group. That self-censorship was, by the way, presented as something noble. We don't want to hurt their feelings. We don't want to offend them. And so it's not a denial of the truth. It's coming from a good place. And then the second development that you mentioned, which I think is pretty much, for me, it's centered in America, American universities, is the development of these neo-Marxist post-colonial theories about justice and about the history of the West, and in particular the history of America. The argument, critical theory, all these different critical theories, that America is founded not on the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, as the founding fathers put it, but it is founded on slavery. It's not 1776, it's 1619. And then there's this emphasis on the slavery, the descendants of slavery, the segregation, and then when America becomes rich and powerful, on America's wars. And the proposition for this narrative is the only way to fix this is to destroy the structures of America. In other words, to bring America down and humble it. If you disagree with that narrative of what social theory is, or justice theory is, then you have to be cancelled. These people don't want to debate anything. Debate, in their understanding of debate, is a product of the white man's white supremacy. It's part of the structures. It's a way of manipulating the poor, the oppressed, into thinking that they're engaged in a conversation. So there came then censorship, which is pretty nasty. People, they vilify people, they make up stories about them, they dig, no one is perfect, but they look for some mistake you made in the past, they magnify that and amplify it, they get people to lose their jobs. A lot of this was happening within universities, and then it spilled out of universities into corporations, into media, into now almost every place, every institution. And that cancellation, it has a lot of similarities with radical Islam. It has no redemption. It doesn't want to debate. It seems to know the answer to every possible question, and all you have to do is to follow it. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the West and in America from the left started to respond to that threat in pretty much the way we responded to the threat in Europe, which was to self-censor, to comply. Hey, these people are talking about marginalized groups. So we white people, we should just shut up and go along, see how far we can go along. This went on and went out of control, I would say, until the election of November 5. the election of Donald Trump, and it looks like a majority of Americans have just had enough of it and said, okay, thank you, but no thank you. I know Donald Trump was elected because of the economic crisis, because of the immigration crisis, but mainly, I would say, number 3, because of this woke ideology that's gone out of control and it's tried to get into every institution. By the way, even though people have had enough of it, it's still within the institutions, so it's going to take us some time to extricate ourselves out of that. Then earlier this year, in the spring, what we saw was this phenomenon where the Islamists on campus allied themselves with the woke, or the woke allied themselves with the Islamists, excusing what the Islamists' objectives are by saying, well, they are colonized, they are marginalized. So Israel, in this sense, is seen as a settler colonial entity, white people colonizing brown people, and it is something that's happening now and that didn't happen in history. And so here's this call to action among all of these students who think they subscribe to various forms of critical theory, critical race theory. If you want to decolonize, it's not theoretical. Come, let's get behind this survival or this action or this struggle for independence and for liberation. And who are we talking about in this story? We're talking about Hamas. And you now have this incredible visual. I mean, to me, I can still see it. You know, young men and women in university, in Columbia, Penn University, MIT, Harvard, standing side by side with pro-Hamas, hardcore pro-Hamas activists, and waving flags and slogans that are exactly what Hamas says about Israel, from the river to the sea, globalize the Intifada, kill the Jews. And it isn't just the Jews in Israel. It is the Jews everywhere. And so it was such a shock for Americans on either side of the two coasts, New York and California, to see that the people they thought were their fellow citizens, their fellow students, even in many ways they belong to the same political party or the same political philosophy, turning on them because from one day to the next, they're Jews.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now, looking at one of the things I find encouraging in this moment is there is a lot of now independent media that's being put out. And I was interested in Courage Media because I was interested in what inspired you to launch your own media platform. There's been quite a few new media platforms in the last couple of years, like very good ones. Unheard is one of them, the Free Press, and you've been on, I think, all of them. Yes. When I last checked, in one form or another, whether it was interviews or whether you've written columns for them. So what inspired you to add your voice to the marketplace of free ideas here and launch your own platform?
So I'll say, first of all, both Free Press and Unheard, and I mean Substack, right? There's a lot of stuff on Substack that I would say is just absolutely excellent. And as new media, and don't forget X. With Elon Musk, really infinitely grateful for what he has done for all of us. So all of that's excellent. Why am I adding my voice to it? With Free Press and Unheard and many others, I find that there is this quest to say, let's hear both sides of the story. On the one hand this, on the other hand that. With Courage Media, I'm saying, there's a lot of platforms, an endless number of platforms to hear that side, right? Other side, on the other hand. But here, I really want to give a voice to those people who, that one hand that wasn't heard, that is never allowed to have a voice, that's always, stumped out. And I have been there. I know that. I have felt the sharp end of the attempts to snuff out my voice. And so this is to say, here is, if you think you need courage and you have something to say and what you're saying is true, empirically true, so that we can research it, we can show that it's true, then here is a place for you, a platform for you. Courage.media is not it's not a newspaper. And I also don't want to say it's ideological, because it is not. It's basically, it's again a quest for the restoration of what makes the West great. And so for us to be able to embark on the mission of restoration, we also want to be able to articulate what is it that is a threat to the West. What is the termite-like forces that are chipping away at Western thought, Western institutions, Christianity, all of these issues. And I want to do it unabashedly, unapologetically. I think the Western civilization is the greatest civilization that ever was. And we need to have the courage to say that, and the courage to try and restore it. And therefore, here is a platform where we can have the conversation about how to go about it.
Did your conversion to Christianity play any role in your decision to launch a new media platform?
I mean, my conversion to Christianity now plays a role in everything I do. It's a way of life, and it is how I live. And so obviously, yes, everything I do is, I like to think about it as praying to God for guidance in how I do it and in doing it the right way.
So one of the questions I had, which I've had for several new media outlets, and I've had the privilege of writing for a bunch of them, is the one place where the traditional media still has kind of the market corner due to resources, et cetera, is most new media companies simply aren't big enough and don't have the resources to do actual on-the-ground reporting. So you do have a small handful of people like Douglas Murray who both go to places themselves and are willing to write for independent media, right? Douglas Murray has been featured in every major conservative newspaper that there is. But for the most part, if you want to get a genuinely accurate update on what's going on the ground in Ukraine, you're going to have to go to, Time Magazine or to the New York Times or to one of these institutions that has been largely captured by left-wing people, at the same time is still putting very brave foreign correspondents on the ground in these places. Whereas, I write for First Things, the European Conservative, the American Conservative, there's Unheard, there's Courage Media, there's the Free Press. Most of those publications can't afford to send somebody to those places to do that kind of reporting. So how do we fill that gap where we're providing an alternative viewpoint, but we're not able to provide some of the original reporting necessary to have a fully actualized view of what's going on?
I also want to point out, by the way, the BBC, the New York Times, some of the Time Magazine, some of those outlets that you just mentioned that do have the resources, they've been incredibly biased. And even when it comes to just reporting on the ground, I'll give you a good example, which was the hospital that was in Gaza hit accidentally by Hamas themselves. And there was a death toll. And first it was reported that Israel had hit that hospital. It wasn't true. And then the death toll was reported. It wasn't true. And all the sources were obviously Hamas related or Hamas compromised. So it's news gathering is a huge problem, and it doesn't require resources. It's also become extremely dangerous. And I see two ways about it. On X, you see sometimes as news is unfolding, people just taking their cell phones and, videotaping whatever is going on and then throwing it out there, and it's instantaneous and it's true, but I mean, you don't have then the editorial capabilities of figuring out what exactly is true, what is not. So at the moment, my answer to you is it's messy. It's going to continue to be messy until, yes, we have enough resources to be able to afford something like that. I also think, do you remember an outlet called Vice?
I do.
Vice came and went. And there might just be, in the works, other people who are trying to look for something like that. A news organization that reports primarily on war zones and dangerous zones and, does that type of work. And is not like the New York Times or the BBC beholden to some narrative that they're trying to push or some political angle that they want us to see instead of just the plain truth. So yeah, the market for that is wide open.
Yeah, because people on the right are now often so skeptical because their trust in institutions is so broken that they start to tend towards the conspiratorial simply because it seems ridiculous to believe. If the BBC says this is going on in Ukraine right now, and they also refer to some brawny male rapist as a she, it just doesn't seem like the BBC is a reliable source of information. And I went to Ukraine for the European Conservative 6 months after the war started, and I would post pictures of the different places I was at, and I had people telling me on X, I can't believe you fell for this. I'm like, I took these pictures myself.
Yeah.
But their trust was so broken that they just didn't believe anything. That if the BBC says it's true, if the New York Times says it's true, it must not be true. That's the conclusion.
Yeah.
And we in alternative media have to find some way through the reflexive skepticism to giving people the information that will help them form a worldview based on accurate on-the-ground reporting.
Yeah. I think you have a point there. Visegrad.
Yes.
Stephen, I think, again, there is a bunch of initiatives. People don't have the resources that the big names, the big media brands have. But the point you make about the loss of trust in the media and in institutions, that's a very serious problem. And there are two ways, I think, of fixing it. One, maybe just that the media market grows and people see for themselves, hey, I don't trust the BBC, but these smaller outlets, if they say they were there, then maybe I'll give that a second chance. Or maybe when people see that something is reported over and over again by different outlets, that might give them a sense of trust. But the one thing that is lost in the West, I hope it's not entirely lost, but for a lot of people it is lost because it's not so much the media, it's the education system, is the critical thinking skill set that some of us take it for granted. That has been compromised. There's almost, I would say, a generation that just hasn't, they've been done a disservice. They haven't been taught how to think critically, the sorts of questions that they ought to ask, the comparisons that they should be making before they reach a conclusion. They just haven't been taught that because the education system was used to indoctrinate them. The education system is politicized. And here I'm referring to America, and it's unfortunately a problem that America has spread outwards into other countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also Europe, the UK. You're seeing that a lot of these bad ideas have been, and these bad ways of doing things have been adopted from Americans. But again, now that America is changing, I hope that changes. One thing I like about the internet is you no longer really need to depend on indoctrinated teachers to indoctrinate you. You can go online and you can find courses on critical thinking. You can find books on critical thinking. And so for us little startup media platforms, our job is to point in the right direction and say, like, I want to advertise what Jordan Peterson is doing now. Him setting up that university where you can actually think and you're challenged in the way you think about the world to make sense of the world. I think there will be, as we go on, a wider selection of sources of critical thinking. And the more individual citizens learn to think critically, the less frightened they become. They won't trust the BBC and the New York Times again, but they will find other sources that they can trust.
Looking at Courage Media, one of the top stories you have there right now is on the Pogrom in Amsterdam, that sort of horrifying scene that unfolded after a soccer match where there was Jews thrown into the canal. People were just, like, rioters were actually checking people's ID to see if they were Jewish to decide whether or not to beat them. And I thought when I was looking at the article on this, like, a lot of people probably have forgotten this, but you're a former Dutch parliamentarian, actually. What was it like for you to see that unfold on the streets of Amsterdam, a city that you love very much? And do you think that this is a harbinger of things to come if we don't deal with it very firmly?
So, saddened, it's tragic, of course. I don't want, Holland is, in my view, the country that emancipated me, right? It's the country that welcomed me and made me into what I am now. So, infinitely grateful to Holland. And to see these things happening there, tragic, shocking and disgusting, but not surprising. Because the problems were there. This is exactly what my whole, the reason why I don't know what they say, what was it, name to fame or infamy, depending again on who you speak to. It all is centered around these problems, the presence of larger numbers of Muslims in the Netherlands and how we failed to integrate them because we said you can stay here, you can live here, but then you assimilate on your own terms, or you integrate on your own terms. And they did. And the numbers kept growing and growing. And we had these problems of the attitude towards women, the attitude towards homosexuals, the attitude towards the Jews. 20 years ago, these problems were manifesting themselves, and to talk about them was problematic. You were thought of as far right and as racist and xenophobic and all the rest of it, all sorts of ways of trying to silence people who were just pointing to what was happening, and if the scale of the problem got bigger, how it would get out of hand. So one of the things 20 years ago, I remember, was Jewish people would report that they felt unsafe because of a growing number of incidents, violent incidents against them. And the government would advise those Jewish people not to look Jewish, not to appear Jewish. The homosexuals would be told the same thing. Women would be told, maybe if you avoid trouble. And so instead of dealing with the new people, bringing in a new religion, a new way of life that threatens the existing way of life, we were accommodating them. So it doesn't surprise me then that given what's said in the mosque, what's said in the Islamic Center, what they hear online, the exposure to the most radical, virulent, anti-Semitic Islamic concept, it doesn't surprise me in the least that that's translated into action, and that this is not the first attempt at a pogrom. There will be more, and it's going to get worse. And because Holland is densely populated, what happens there doesn't stay there. It is a harbinger for other countries. It was in Holland that first we were talking about how it's just difficult and exceptional to integrate Muslims. And then the British were talking about it, and the French were talking about it, and the Belgians and the Swedes. So on this issue, it was always Holland that goes first. And by the way, I don't want to say in terms of the Islamist-driven anti-Semitism that it is Holland that's going first now. You remember after October 7, 2023, that in every major city with a large population of Muslims, there were these sustained protests, 100,000 big, sometimes more than that, weekend after weekend after weekend, calling for the elimination of Israel, globalized the Intifada from the river to the sea, very, very anti-Semitic. So, it's just a matter of time before that, then, obviously.
Yeah, a Jewish man was told in Montreal, a rabbi, that he shouldn't be wearing his kippah in public because it would make him a target. This is in Montreal with one of North America's oldest Jewish communities. And that kind of leads me to one of the questions I'd really wanted to ask, because I've been part of so many discussions at different magazines and publications about how do you police the right flank? because that is one of the most difficult things, I think, for conservative leaning media or libertarian media outlets that just want to give canceled people a voice, as you put it. But there's always the chance that you're going to get these people that are genuine crackpots, right? So we still do need to have boundaries. We need to have guardrails up on the left, and we need to have guardrails up on the right. Now, that's a little bit easier to do, I think, because the war in Gaza has flushed a lot of people out, and so a lot of people are stating opinions in ways that are not ambiguous, and I find that to be helpful. But how do you propose when we want freedom of speech to still recognize that there are some voices we want to platform, but there are some voices that we don't want to platform? There are, frankly, some voices we want to remain marginal.
I agree with you, and I think that you do it case by case. I got a question the other day about Tommy Robinson, and so I look into it personally. What has he said, and does he qualify for the vilification far right and racist and xenophobic? And I find that he does not, because and here's, I think, why there is so much confusion. A lot of these terms that were exclusively used for evil deeds, right? They were to qualify evil deeds. To label someone Hitler, you don't do it as an off-the-cuff remark. Hitler did evil. He was the devil incarnate, right? He gassed 6 million Jewish people, killed homosexuals, plunged Europe into war. The man was evil. So if you're going to call someone far right, or you're going to call them racist, or you're going to compare them to Hitler, it better be serious, right? If we should have, and here's part of courage also, is to try and reclaim the language that we use, so that we use the right label for the right thing. But what happened in the last 20 years was everyone who disagreed with the immigration policies and the policies around Islam, with the government and the mainstream media, was vilified and ostracized and cancelled and called far right and racist. And so you cheapened that. And these words now have no meaning at all. I don't know if you followed our election in America, but these serious media outlets, Kamala Harris, is Donald Trump fascist? And she said, yes, I think he is. And then all these media guys were calling him Hitler. And then a day after they elect, they're all sitting at Mar-a-Lago now. And he's not Hitler anymore. Do you see what happened to the language? And if you do this, we were just talking about whether the media is trustworthy or not trustworthy. If the New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, if they do this, if they carry on, they look at their audiences in the eye and they say Donald Trump is just like Hitler. And then a day later, they're sitting in Mar-a-Lago. Obviously, the audiences think these people are not serious. And then if you look at the younger audiences who have no clue who Hitler is because they haven't been properly educated, they have no way actually of making a distinction between right and wrong, morally evil, morally right. They think maybe it's just another name out there, So we are in a crisis because of the cheapening of the language. We just use the Holocaust off the cuff. We say a lot of things that we shouldn't be saying. And so I think the only way to keep the far right marginalized is to go back and define these things in the ways that they used to be defined. If you are a white working class man and you're worried about your neighborhood transforming and getting neighbors that don't get along with you, that harass women, that there's a lot of crime and grime, and you complain about that, that doesn't make you far right. If you join a group of people who call themselves skinheads and who say that all people except those who are white should either be enslaved, banished, or killed, that's far right. That's the way we used to define it. And if we do it, then we should be able to completely marginalize the groups that should be marginalized. By the way, that applies to the left. All these people we call woke, who have infiltrated and infected universities, schools, corporations, and the media with their mind virus, they too should be marginalized. But again, we weren't teaching anyone about what Stalin did, what the gulags were. Far left extremism was embraced because it's all shrouded in the words of justice and purity and emancipation and liberation. And so we give them a pass. But actually, in many ways, they're just as bad or worse.
Ayaan, thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. And good luck with you and your platform.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you want to hear other conversations like it, you can subscribe. You can also find our content wherever you get your podcasts, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we post both written commentary and video. Thanks so much for joining us.